Pull a bicycle out of any American garage today that has been sitting there since 1987. Dust off the top tube, and there is a very good chance you are holding a piece of steel that is worth more today than the day it was bought. Chromoly tubing, lugged frame construction, the gentle bend of a fork made by hand in Wisconsin or Tochigi or Birmingham. The 1980s were the last great decade of steel bicycles, and the frames that filled driveways in Cleveland, suburbs in London, and apartment hallways in Brooklyn have become some of the most collected vintage objects of the entire decade. So let us walk through them together. The road bikes, the mountain bikes, the touring bikes, and the absolute boat anchors. And as we go, ask yourself one question. Which one of these did you actually have? We start at the top of every American kid's bike journey, the Schwinn factory in Chicago. The Schwinn Varsity was the heaviest, the cheapest, and the most produced 10-speed in American history. If your dad bought you a Schwinn in 1982 and you remember it weighing more than your little brother, you had a Varsity. The Varsity had Ashtabula one-piece cranks, gum wall tires, and a frame so robust that examples are still being ridden today in commuter lanes from Portland to Pittsburgh. Then came the Schwinn Continental, slightly lighter, slightly more elegant, and the bike that introduced an entire generation of American kids to drop bars and 10 gears. Above the Continental sat the Schwinn Latour, the bike many of us actually wanted, with a lugged steel frame and Japanese components that finally moved Schwinn into the modern era. And right at the top, almost nobody owned one, but everybody photographed one, the Schwinn Paramount. Hand-built in the Paramount shop with Reynolds 531 tubing, a Campagnolo Gruppo, and a price tag that put it firmly in the same conversation as European pro race bikes. If you grew up east of the Mississippi, your dream bike probably did not say Schwinn on it. It said Trek. The Trek factory opened in Waterloo, Wisconsin in 1976. And by 1982, they had become the most respected American steel frame builder. The Trek 520 was the touring bike of the decade. Lugged chromoly construction, eyelets for racks and fenders, geometry built for long days in the saddle with 30 pounds of camping gear. Every cyclist who toured America in the 80s either owned a 520 or wanted to. The Trek 720 was the upgraded version, with Reynolds 531 tubing and an even smoother ride. And the Trek 760, the racing-oriented frame, was the bike that put Trek into bike shops in every American city. If you bought a road bike in Madison, Wisconsin or Boulder, Colorado in 1985, you almost certainly bought a Trek. But the 80s were not just about road bikes. Something extraordinary was happening up in Northern California. In 1981, a small company in Morgan Hill called Specialized released the Stump Jumper, the first mass-produced mountain bike in American history. The Stump Jumper had a lugged steel frame, gum wall tires, and cantilever brakes, and it was sold at bike shops alongside road bikes that had never seen dirt. The original Stump Jumper now sits in the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C., which gives you some idea of how much the bike changed American cycling. Right beside Specialized, a guy named Gary Fisher in Marin County was building his own mountain bikes, and the Gary Fisher Mount Tam became the second iconic mass-produced mountain bike of the decade. Tom Ritchie, working out of Palo Alto, was building Ritchie mountain bikes that were even more refined, and the early Ritchie Annapurna and Ritchie Timberline frames are now collector-grade pieces selling for thousands of dollars to the cycling museum crowd. If you were a serious mountain biker by the middle of the decade, your bike probably came from a brand the road riders had never heard of. The Bridgestone MB series, designed in Japan and imported by Grant Peterson in California, became the connoisseur's choice. for steel mountain biking. The Bridgestone MB1, MB2, and MB3 are still ridden today by riders who refuse to accept that suspension was an improvement. The Univega Alpina, the Mongoose IBOC, the Diamondback Apex, and the specialized Rockhopper filled bike shops across America with affordable steel mountain bikes that taught millions of Americans how to ride off-road. If you are enjoying this walk through the steel bike garage of the 80s, hit subscribe. We are covering every iconic piece of 1980s culture week by week. Now let us get to the European bikes that changed the way American cyclists thought about racing. The Bianchi Specialissima was the Italian race bike that arrived in America in Celeste green and quietly captured the hearts of every serious club rider. Bianchi was the oldest bicycle company in the world, founded in 1885 in Milan, and the 80s Specialissima, examples with Columbus Tubing and Campagnolo Gruppos, are now among the most valuable used road bikes on the planet. The Peugeot PX10 arrived from France with simplex shifters and Mafac brakes, and the PX10 became the bike of every weekend road racer in the New York and Boston cycling scenes. The Moto Bacane Le Champion brought French frame craftsmanship to American kids whose parents could not justify a Bianchi. And from Britain, the Raleigh Record, Raleigh Grand Prix, and Raleigh Supercourse flooded American department stores with respectable English steel at prices anybody could reach. If your first 10-speed was a Raleigh, you were one of millions. Now we get to the bikes that defined the touring and triathlon world. The Centurion Ironman was the most famous triathlon bike of the entire decade. Sold in bike shops across America from 1983 onward, the Ironman had aero everything and a paint scheme so distinctive that even people who did not know what triathlon was could recognize the bike. The Cannondale Sports Touring SR500 was actually built from steel before Cannondale became the aluminum company we remember it as today. And the early Cannondale Bugatti and SR Series steel frames are now respected collector pieces. The Fuji Del Rey and Fuji Sagres brought Japanese craftsmanship to American bike shops at half the price of European frames. And the Univega Specialissima brought Italian-style geometry to mid-range buyers across North America. For mountain biking enthusiasts who wanted the absolute best, the late 80s brought the boutique builders into the conversation. Salsa Cycles in Petaluma, California, was building handmade steel mountain bike frames that were considered the absolute pinnacle of off-road steel. Klein, before they were bought by Trek, was building lugged steel frames in Chehalis, Washington, that competed directly with Ritchie for the connoisseur dollar. Yeti Cycles in Loveland, Colorado started in 1985 and built the FRO, a steel mountain bike that became the foundation of the entire modern mountain bike industry. And Rocky Mountain Bicycles up in Vancouver, British Columbia, were building the Hammer and the Stratos, steel mountain bike frames that became the bikes of the entire Pacific Northwest racing scene. The mid-range mountain bike world had its own heroes. The GT Karakoram became the most popular GT mountain bike of the decade, with a triple triangle frame design that was instantly recognizable on any trail. The GT Tolera, the slightly cheaper version, became the entry point for thousands of kids in the late 80s who wanted to start mountain biking but did not have a budget for a stump jumper. The Diamondback Apex, the Diamondback Ascent, and the Diamondback Mountain Crest filled every Toys R Us and bike shop across America with affordable mountain bikes that introduced an entire generation to off-road riding. If your steel bike was British, there is a good chance it was a Raleigh, but there were others. The Holdsworth Professional, with its hand-cut lugs and Reynolds 531 tubing, was the bike of every serious British club racer of the early 80s. The Mercian frames, hand-built in Derby, England, were the absolute pinnacle of British steel craftsmanship, and the Falcon frames, with their distinctive paint schemes, filled British bike shops with everyday road bikes that thousands of British kids learned to ride on. In Japan, the steel frame story is its own documentary. The Miata bikes, especially the Miata 600 Touring and the Miata 1000 Sport, became the absolute reference for Japanese touring frames in the 80s. Panasonic, before they decided bicycles were not their future, built some of the most respected Japanese road bikes of the decade. The Panasonic Pro Series frames with double-butted chromoly tubing are now sought after by Japanese vintage bicycle collectors. The Nishiki Olympic, the Nishiki Cresta, and the Nishiki Sebring were sold in American bike shops alongside Trek and Schwinn, and millions of American kids learned to ride drop bars on Nishiki frames. So why does any of this matter today? Because the entire bicycle industry has come full circle. Walk into any premium bike shop in Brooklyn, Portland, or San Francisco today, and you will see steel frames hanging on the wall. Often hand-built in small batches by builders, charging $4,000 for a frame that looks remarkably similar to the Schwinn Latour or the Trek 520 your dad bought you for $179 in 1984. The young cycling crowd has discovered what the older cycling crowd never forgot. Steel frames flex in ways that aluminum cannot. They absorb road buzz, they hold their value, they can be repaired forever, and they have a kind of silent grace that the carbon racing crowd has only recently started talking about again. The vintage steel market is now expanding every year. A clean Schwinn Paramount in original paint sells for thousands. A 1987 Trek 520 in original condition sells for more than $1,000. The early stump jumpers, the early Richies, the early Bridgestones, all of them have become museum pieces, selling for prices that would have stunned the original owners. So tell us in the comments, which one of these steel frames did you actually have? Was it the Schwinn Latour your dad picked up at the local shop? The Raleigh Grand Prix you found at a yard sale? The specialized stump jumper that opened up the mountain trails behind your school? The Trek 520 you took across America on a summer tour? Or was it some forgotten frame we did not even mention, leaning against the wall of your parents' garage right now, waiting for you to come back and ride it again? If you enjoyed this trip back into the steel age of cycling, hit subscribe and ring the bell. We are working through every iconic piece of 1980s culture, one video at a time. And if you have a vintage steel frame in your basement, do not throw it out. Restore it, ride it, and remember that you are holding the last great era of bicycle craftsmanship in your hands.